I'm going to
All right, I'm
stop
sharing my
sharing.
screen. I want to make sure is my screen sharing.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. It's great to have as much social interaction as possible in this crazy world. And been able to speak to the GT Engineers Without Borders a couple of times in the past, but it's been a while. And I really enjoyed my interaction with them. Although I might, I hope I don't offend anyone today, and I want to be really clear that we are big supporters of Engineers Without Borders, although we have some minor quibbles that maybe we'll get to talk about. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about my VIP. That was our first semester last semester. Now we have about 18 to 20 students working on this VIP in global social entrepreneurship, and they're basically taking some of the concepts and models from this book that's coming out from Columbia and using it to do social enterprise. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, just a really brief introduction to how I ended up here is that I did a lot of work in Fiji for about 10 years on drug discovery and local development, and we had a lot of eye-opening experiences there. All of our projects failed, even though they were well funded. They were in really important magazines. They were logically very sound. We had incredible local partners, and they were really, looking back, I mean, really brilliant development projects, and they all failed. And I had two epiphanies there. One was I was talking to someone on our board who's this banker, and he looked at me and said, "Of course they all failed. They're startups. Startups almost always fail. And so why do we think because we're doing philanthropy or global development that projects are going to have a much higher success rate than businesses that start up in the United States, where we know the culture and the language, and we have networks and connections, etc." The other epiphany I had in Fiji was talking to a gentleman who was in Fiji when they closed down the Peace Corps after 30 years. And he was given a job in part of the close down to examine all of the projects that were started by Peace Corps volunteers over that 30-year period of time, which was like 1,000 projects. And one of the questions that he looked at when he went and visited these communities was, how long did the project last after the Peace Corps volunteer left? And he looked at it, all of these, and in one of them was how many were still functioning a year after the Peace Corps volunteer left, and the answer was 0. And 0 is a very small number. That's a really high failure rate. And sometimes we dismiss these global development failures as, fell forward, or, we have to learn and correct our mistakes. And we look at them a lot like venture capitalists look at startups in the Silicon Valley, that, failure is a badge of honor. But these failures have huge costs. They cause development delay, etc. So we decided to try and come up with a better model of global philanthropy that had a much higher success rate and was much more empowering to the locals. And I convinced my California banker friend to fund this project of $500,000. And we ended up doing 24 demonstration projects in Brazil, in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. And we had a really incredible experience. So we ended up writing this book and starting this VIP and kind of continuing on this particular model. So what do we try to do? We try to relentlessly be efficient and subversive. And what do we mean by efficient and subversive? Efficient is merely that we want to have the biggest bang for the buck. Instead of having a 80% failure rate, we want a 99% success rate. And we think we can do that by following this particular model that we developed. And we think we can do it quickly, and we think that we can aim at a particular unit of social change, which is the neighborhood, and really get a lot of bang for the buck. And then second, we want to be subversive. And what do we mean by subversive? We want to upend existing power relations that have developed from a certain racism that existed under the era of colonialism and the white man's burden, but is morphed into some implicit bias. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, we want to have products. We've made now 6 documentary films with top directors. They've been in the big film festivals, and they've been in 500 schools in Rio de Janeiro. And now we have this other projects that I'll talk about at the end. So what are we talking about when we talk about, and anyone can interrupt at any time. Just don't hold up your hand because I can't see that. Just turn on your microphone and interrupt, and you're welcome at any time. So if we go back to 1899, that was when we had the publishing of this very famous poem, The White Man's Burden, of Rudyard Kipling, which is absolutely racist in everything that it talks about. Take up the white man's burden, and you're going to go and try and save these backward people that are half devil and half child, and you will have such a great project, and you'll be so sacrificing, and you'll work for them, and in the end, it's going to all be a disaster. But why is it a disaster? Because the people you are working with have low character, and they're lazy, and they're not grateful for what you're trying to do for them, etc. And of course, any of us can read The White Man's Burden, and we're really repelled by it. It's full of eugenics and racism. That's terrible. But if you look at contemporary philanthropy, it's almost exactly the same, just with slightly nicer language. Whenever we talk to people who have had failed philanthropy projects, they always identify the local culture as the reason that their great idea did not work. And it's really very, very similar. So we wrote a poem that I'm not going to read to you, but I mean, if you change the language from 1899 to 2020, there is no difference between how global philanthropy is done today and what Kipling was talking about in 1899. We have the same process. We send forth our most noble and our brightest and our best with modern technology, and we're going to bring salvation to people who are backwards and who need our ideas and our innovation and our help. And we are selfless, and we work so hard, and usually it ends in failure. And how do we explain that failure? That they have a backwards culture, right? And that is something that we think is a problem with the entire model of contemporary global philanthropy. You can see this best exemplified, and I'm sure that many of you have already gone to this site, which is a Portuguese site called Humanitarians of Tinder, which is people who put up dating profile pictures exploiting the dark-skinned people of color, usually children, in photos that are, really terrible. But somehow we all think that this is perfectly acceptable because we are humanitarians, right? Everyone's a philanthropist. Everyone's a humanitarian. And we have these big ideas. Now, some of these ideas are funded with hundreds of millions of dollars. For example, the play pumps in Africa, or the one laptop per child, or the Millennium Villages of Jeffrey Sachs in Africa, with the brightest people at Columbia and MIT. They get huge amounts of support from the press. And even with these, the failure rate is really astonishing. How few of these projects maybe do more harm than good, or maybe turn people off a lot because of the someone like Jeff Sachs, who's a genius of a economist. He helicopters in with Angelina Jolie. They get their praise as the great professor, and then they helicopter out. And when the problems develop, they blame the locals every time for the problems that developed. And this leads to development fatigue. If I had $1 for every abandoned tilapia farm around the planet, I would be a very rich man. And in some places like Fiji, for example, which has had wave after wave after wave of student group, religious group, family group, the Kiwanis, et cetera, they've come in to Fiji and gone to the villages and sat in the circle with the chief and done the kava ceremony and promised to bring civilization and development to the village. And then look at all the abandoned projects that litter the village. Now the chief, they roll their eyes when they hear this pitch because they have development fatigue, which is one of the costs of all of these failed projects. Now, we can look from, it's hard in philanthropy to get an exact count. We can look at other areas. For example, in commercial project success, of every 3,000 great ideas, only one becomes an actual successful product. And we think that that's probably analogous to what happens in global philanthropy. So what do we say? We say that in order to have a much higher bang for the buck or greater efficiency, you need to invert the model. So instead of the people from the United States and Europe being the leaders and the innovators and the designers, etc., we need to take on the role as sidekicks. And the people from the places in the global South, they need to be the leaders. I mean, for one, the children of those communities, when they think of role models, they don't need to think of someone who looks like me. They need to think like of someone that looks like they do. And role models are increasingly important. And this whole year we've heard about, two things above all. One, how much implicit bias there is in policing, in the judicial system, in education, towards people of color, towards women, towards fat people, etc. And we claim that there's a lot of implicit bias in global philanthropy. On the other, of course, now is we have COVID-19, which means that we have a much greater responsibility to get every amount of efficiency out of every dollar or other resource expended in global philanthropy. So this is kind of an example of what we think is helpful, and we're developing some simulations and actually making some playing cards to show this. So you see on the bottom you have some famous philanthropists. One kind of infamous, the guy with the 3 cups of tea, who turned out to be a bit of a charlatan, but still he's a superstar, rock star philanthropist. And then on the right, we have some of our local partners from Brazil, 2 of them who are illiterate, and the other who is an Afro-Brazilian man who lived from age 7 to age 18 in a juvenile detention center. Now, imagine that you have a deck of cards, and you have 4 suits of cards, and on 2 of those suits, you have the pictures of, one suit would be all people that look like Bill Gates, and the other suit would be all people who look like Tia Maria or Zefa de Guia or Sebastian Oliveira on the right. And then you have one suit with the very positive words under the global north implicit bias: superhero, innovator, leader, disciplined, senior partner, trustworthy, policymaker, charitable, brilliant, praiseworthy, administrator, take charge, efficient, and culture of success. And in the other suit of cards, you have sidekick, heavy lifter, follower, lethargic, junior partner, potentially corrupt, stakeholder, grateful, etc. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have done these simulations, but what you do is you match the people that look like Bill Gates, and you stack them along with the leader superhero words, and you stack the people that look like Sebastian with the global south follower words, sidekicks, and you time yourself. And then you time yourself doing the opposite, putting all of those leader superhero words with the people who look like Sebastian and the people who look like Bill Gates with the potentially corrupt junior partner, lethargic follower, etc. And it takes a lot more time to do the second than it does the first, because we have in our mind this implicit bias, which are these patterns and associations and ideas of who should be an innovator and who should be a local stakeholder. And unfortunately, this really leads to a situation where we have local innovators and superheroes on the ground in the communities we serve, and we don't even identify them or find them. We actually suck up the oxygen, and we make their life much more difficult when we ride in with all of the solutions and ideas and innovation and the swagger that only Americans have. And so in essence, we cause more harm than good. Now, these three people on the right are the most innovative leaders I've ever met. None of them had a leadership course. None of them graduated college. Two are illiterate. And yet they are transforming their neighborhoods in ways you could hardly imagine. The guy on the bottom, Sebastian, he built a badminton center. Took him 17 years with 4 indoor courts. He never played badminton. He developed a methodology of teaching badminton through samba dancing. 2 of his athletes were in the last Olympics. One was the gold medalist in the Pan Am Games, and they destroy all of the elite teams in Brazil in badminton. And he's changed his whole neighborhood with that methodology. And people say, oh, that's extraordinary. That's like a unicorn. No, that's not. These marginalized neighborhoods are full of local leaders who are doing incredibly innovative things. And we partnered with 6 of them, but we could have partnered with over 100 organizations in Brazil and just in Rio in the favelas who had a 10-year track record of success, who were led by locals and who used high levels of innovation. So we made films about these organizations. Why? Because we wanted the kids to have role models that look like they do. So these are kids in Rio during the Olympics. We showed the films 500 times for free in the favelas. And we know when we started, a lot of people said, oh, you cannot have kids watch 1-hour documentary films. They will have zero interest. And time after time after time, the kids were mesmerized. And we asked, why is that? And we got the same answer over and over. They had never seen a movie or a portrayal of Afro-Brazilian women and men that was positive. They're always portrayed as drug dealers or, as lazy, as drunks, as irresponsibles, etc. And so for these kids to actually see people who looked like them, who were superheroes, that was something that was very powerful. And a lot of the kids came 5 nights in a row, watched all 5 films, and then we put the films along with a teacher's manual in 500 schools. We then have been working with a VIP at Georgia Tech to find new partners in Colombia and to make new documentary films. But also we've decided to start doing this children's book series. And so this children's book is about this kid, Scout, who is autistic, lives in Atlanta, mom's a pilot, so the family goes places, and Scout has a superpower of finding real-life superheroes. The first book is in Rio de Janeiro, and Scout finds Sebastian, the badminton guy, and so the book is about this adventure of Scout and the story of Sebastian. And we have this really magical model, which for every book we sell in English, we distribute 2 books in Portuguese in the favelas of Rio, because the kids don't have very many books. And so quality children's book, especially that helps to battle the implicit bias, we think is really important. And this was on the picture on the left. The guy standing there on the left is Sebastião, and the guy with the mask close up is Igor Coelho, who now lives in Denmark. He's the number 30th ranked badminton player in the world, and is trained in Denmark. He was in the last Olympics in Brazil and is the current gold medalist of the Americas from the Pan Am Games. And Monday was Children's Day, so we rushed, and we had our first distribution of free children's books to the kids in Rio de Janeiro. And these books are cool because it gives the family access to the film, to watch the documentary about Sebastião, so they can reinforce this local superhero. And we're building games and coloring books and other activities. And the book also has both Portuguese and English, and a QR code for a voice in native English and native Portuguese to read the book for those using the book to learn English. So we have an idea about social enterprise, which is not a new concept. It's been going on for hundreds of years. You know, the Jesuits, when they did the missions in South America, they were doing social enterprise by selling mate. And social enterprise is we try and think it's something brand new, but it's been going on forever. But we have a particular model of social enterprise whereby we develop products that even if they never make a penny, if they never sell one, they still have a massive positive influence. And they're always developed around the idea of eroding this implicit bias and celebrating these local heroes and role models. And so we have students working on games. We have students writing the next book. We have students finding our partners that we're going to have in Colombia. And then we'll be making documentary films in Colombia with Colombians. And then we'll be using street artists. So all of our books are illustrated by local street artists. So we think that, I don't know if you can see very well, but our book now is illustrated by this guy Kaze, and so they're all watercolor. He does all these watercolors that take like 4 days to do, and they're really fantastic. If anyone is in the mood for a children's book, then you can go to scoutheroes.com and see what we're doing. Everything's a little rough now because we've been doing all of this just since August. And then the other thing we did, just because of the need, we did do a global giving crowdfunding for Sebastião. We helped them in the spring. They've distributed 72.5 tons of food to their neighborhoods, and we raised enough money in our crowdfunding campaign to feed 500 families of 4 for 1 month, and also to set aside $7,800 for the athletes to get back to tournaments once that is permissible under COVID. So that's essentially all. I just wanted to give a very brief overview and have some time for some discussion. And that's essentially what we're doing. And it's been really exciting. It's grown much faster than we expected. We're in a place of privilege though, because we don't have an office, we don't have an employee, I work for Georgia Tech and I can dedicate some time to this. And now I've turned it into a book at Columbia, so I'm getting my academic benefit. My partner's a banker who's retired, and then our labor is free from these VIP students. But we think that we're able to get a huge bang for the buck, and we're able to obliterate this implicit bias instead of reinforcing it. And that's the one thing I would really recommend that people consider, at least. What is the real likelihood that something that's done is going to be a long-term success? And I think we have to really pass on this idea that, well, let's try 100 things and one of those things will work and then we'll scale it up, because that is not true. The global development projects do not scale. If it works in one community, there are 100 reasons why it might not work in the next community. And if a project fails, it's also not true that you can identify what went wrong and fix it for the next iteration. That's a very engineering way of thinking, right? Why did my bridge collapse? Oh, my bridge collapsed because this formula is wrong. So we fix this formula, and then the next bridge we build will not collapse. And let's now say, okay, global development is the same way. We tried to do this project in Peru, and it was a failure. Let's look at why did it fail, and then the next time it won't fail. Well, there are 1,000 factors that go into why a startup of any kind fails or succeeds. And if you look at franchises fail at almost the identical rate as a standalone entity. And so those are the two things I would think that we really need to at least consider when we do something. What's the likelihood it's going to fail? And not think that failure is okay because it'll eventually scale up. And then finally, are we empowering local leaders? Are we sidekicks? And I urge everyone to go to sidekickmanifesto.org and think about taking the sidekick oath. We discovered the Sidekick Manifesto long after we had finished right when we were finishing our book. Someone said, "Hey, you should look at the Sidekick Manifesto." And it would have saved us a lot of time because they had really good resources, and it is almost exactly how we ended up thinking about global philanthropy. So I will stop there. I've talked too long. Thanks for your patience. And now if anyone wants to, chime in, push back, or, ask any questions, I'm happy.
I see a question in the chat. You want to address that one, please?
Yeah, I think that Georgia Tech, has a great role to play, because Georgia Tech now is getting to a point where we have locals all over the place. I'm having a meeting on the 22nd, a town hall with Brazilian alumni of Georgia Tech who are living in Brazil and who don't feel so connected to a lot of the types of donations and giving that Georgia Tech is always appealing for, like put your name on a building. That gives them no satisfaction. They have no interest in that. But they do have interest in working on these kinds of projects, right? And they also have connections. We work with the alumni in Colombia right now, and they're helping for us to identify some of these local champions, and also to have us work in conjunction with local film schools. And so Georgia Tech, because it has now this global reach and so many engineers in Latin America, and being an engineer gives a certain prestige in Latin America that maybe doesn't happen in some other places. Well, it's prestigious everywhere, but it has an extra prestige in Latin America when you're Ingeniero Bowman instead of just Kirk Bowman. So I think Georgia Tech can really make some big headway. And also, I mean, there are things that can be done at Georgia Tech in as a sidekick. For example, we're working with the DLAC lab to develop games, right? And to add elements to the web page that can be really appealing to the kids and can be supportive of these locals that are happening there. I came to the conclusion once that, the biggest innovation labs or incubators in Latin America are in these super marginalized neighborhoods. Why? Because they have to be crazy innovative to survive. And the environment is changing every single day. And they have to adjust and adapt and learn. And so I think Georgia Tech could learn a lot from them, and Georgia Tech could be a great partner to a lot of these local leaders.
Hey, Dr. Bowman. My name is Shlok. I totally resonated with what you were talking about in terms of sucking up the oxygen. My parents are like from Rwanda, so they like consistently talked about how being there, but being like Indian, right, like was a completely different experience. And
Hmm.
the locals developed an understanding, not necessarily through like an intentional white man's burden or anything, that like they were different than like people who are, Indian or white expatriates, and even like black expatriates from like Dubai and those kind of Middle Eastern areas, just are like almost inherently different than they were.
Uh-huh.
So like they weren't qualified for the same positions. One thing I want to ask you about is a lot of these nations are under technologically developed, and like a lot of people have been trying to push technological related investment plans, like you mentioned, like giving laptops to kids and things like that. But and I was wondering, like, do you think those are useful? Because I feel like a lot of currently developed nations were developed even before like laptops and technology existed.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if it's like a misfire.
Well, I think you've identified a really tricky issue, and I think technology can be amazing and very useful. The problem is when it's the default solution to every problem. And I think that's we've developed this cult of technology. Kentaro Toyama talks about in his book Geek Heresy, which if you haven't read, you should read that book. Where if you go to any type of meeting on solving local problems in a poor neighborhood, the only things that are discussed are throwing technology at it. And usually the solutions for social challenges come from social innovation or process innovation and not product innovation. So as long as it's the right tool and it's not, the automatic default is to go to technology, which sadly that's what it is right now. And that's why I think we have all of these failed projects. I mean, if you read the Nina Monk's book on the Millennium Villages with $250 million and a 147-page single-space manual from Columbia University, and they connected the dots in everything they did from the implementation to the solution without ever thinking about what are going to be the social cleavages that could happen in the villages that some people are winners and losers, for example. I think this was one of the most misunderstood or identified challenge of everything that we do. When we failed in Fiji with project after project, if I said the number one reason we failed is because if you go into a village, you don't have the capacity of identifying who are the warring factions in this village trying to be chief and who benefits from this and what are the jealousies and the cleavages and the long-term problems that you are bringing into this community without even thinking about it. Now that happens all the time, and so technology. I mean, the one laptop for child is a really great adventure. They thought, if you go back and look at what Nicholas Negroponte and the others were saying at the beginning, by merely giving laptops, then it's like build it and they will come, right? Give the laptops and 1,000 forests will bloom. And I mean, it's just been a complete disaster. Even in Uruguay is the most from one laptop per child, and there's zero evidence of any benefit whatsoever. So technology is great, but I think as a supplement and not as the solution.
Another question I wanted to ask is, you said you got your funding from a banker business partner,
Yeah.
and I was kind of wondering, one, how'd you convince a banker to give you just money to fund the project? And two, has like the influence of someone coming from a return on investment kind of perspective changed the way you've done things for good or for worse?
Yeah, so this is actually, I think, an interesting story. The guy is my best friend since I was 23 years old. And he is I think I'm a very progressive college professor, and he is a Republican banker from Orange County, California. So the exact opposite, right? Um, and he totally changed my view because I had read all of the development manuals, the books, and I knew the procedures and everything. And he coming from a community bankers, especially community bankers have super small margins. They have to have a default rate of less than a third of a percent. And so they have this essentially sidekick model. They're never in the newspaper, they're anonymous. And what do? They give expansion money to successful organizations with high character leaders and a long track record of success. And by following that, they succeed almost every time. So we took that banker's model and we adapted it to global philanthropy on how we choose our partners. We find people with a super high character, very well respected, at least a 10-year track record of success, and able to take expansion money and use it immediately. And also imagine all of their fixed costs are paid for. The building's done. They're functioning fully. You're giving them expansion money. Imagine you find $100 in your shorts when you wash them. You're like, wow, that's the greatest money you ever found. It feels like $1 million. And for them to have someone come in and say, hey, we're going to give you $25,000 a year for 4 years as long as you do what you say you're going to do. And they tell us what they're going to do. We have a one-page application process, and we have a one-page impact report, because that whole idea of impact has become a complete disaster. It's illogical. It's demeaning. I mean, right now we do impact where you have a situation, you give an intervention, and then you measure the change after the intervention. So there's probably 90 variables that could have an impact on that outcome, and we're trying to assign it to one. I mean, it makes zero sense, right? But we do it as a way of disciplining the people that receive grants instead of benefiting the most. So we ask people sometimes, we have a circus we work with, and the guy said, we don't want the money if it makes us spend all of our time doing bullshit jobs, right? And the world is full of bullshit jobs. And the biggest bullshit job at the university is assessment of teaching and learning, which is completely nonsense. And then in global philanthropy, it's all of this impact assessment, which is a complete waste of time. And sometimes it takes, 30, 40, 50% of the grant for these little teeny organizations to do the impact assessment. And they should be, this guy's working at a social circus. He should be spending all of his time with the kids in the social circus and not making up data to appease the impact assessors. I went off on a tangent there, but I get angry over a lot of things. That's one of them.
Totally fine. I just want to say, we accept and welcome, criticism of the EWB model as well. That's something we consider. And the mentor I dealt with the project I worked on EWB, we were, together criticizing some aspects of the model, talking about things that we would change, both in relation directly to our project and, spreading it up the pipeline of leadership with regards to an entire national organization. So we do welcome that. And after this, we hope to continue the conversation as well to get your input, as well as perhaps input of students that you've had as well. One of the things you mentioned, engineers tend to have a pretty narrow pipeline, and I say that as an engineering student at Georgia Tech. I think we need more into majors. That's something we've been trying to work on for a while, and that's something we haven't been successful with. So if you could offer any advice in that way, maybe that's something we can talk about another time. I did want to say, one thing we were trying to work on last semester, and we're trying to focus on again this semester, is trying to organize organizations at Georgia Tech that are working on sort of global development, but also local development, because a lot of these issues translate to those projects as well, to kind of centralize our resources, discuss the different models that all of these projects use, and kind of learn from our takeaways. Moving forward, maybe that would completely change our model, and that's completely okay if that's the route we need to go in. So that's something we're trying to get started, and we're having issues doing. I was curious about your thoughts kind of on that direction, and if you have any suggestions, or if you disagree with that.
Yeah, you might not be surprised to hear that I have really strong opinions on that. But I think if there's one thing to praise about engineers in general and Engineers Without Border in specific, is their complete willingness to assess, reassess, take criticism, try and improve. Is really I think it stands out as like the leading organization for that kind of intellectual honesty that we should all have. So kudos on that. We try in our book, one of the things we try to do is identify why is everyone a philanthropist now. There's that episode of Seinfeld where George says he's trying to figure out what job he's going to do next in his life. He goes, "Oh, I'm going to be a philanthropist, a kick-ass philanthropist. Everyone will love me, da, 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 da." And if you look at the percentage of people who are doing philanthropy and global philanthropy, it's really incredible. And I think one of the reasons we do is because we have so much inequality, and so everyone thinks they have to go to the right college and the right grad school, and to get in the right college or the right grad school in the age of this violin is better than harmonica, or being able to build an app is seen as more desirable than being able to rebuild a car engine. We have told all of our kids since they were 4 years old that they have to do these particular activities over these other activities, making them all miserable in the process. And second, that everyone has to have leadership on their resume, and a particular kind of leadership, right, on top of that. And so this leads to all of these crazy things like orphan tourism, which is one of the biggest creators of human trafficking on the planet, and is one of the worst activities that could ever be done. But everyone thinks that it looks good on their Tinder photo and on their resume. So I used to be on the committee at Georgia Tech that approved new clubs on campus, new student organizations. And I'm a big fan of student organization. I think it's one of the centerpieces of student life and what makes American universities great. But we'd often have students come in putting forth the ideas of a new club that largely replicated an existing club. And we would say, why don't you just join this existing club? And they were like, well, we want to be leaders because we need leadership on our resumes. And so we have created a culture of all Indians and no heavy lifters, right? And I think that what makes the world really work are the heavy lifters. And we have this cult of leadership and this cult of technology, and you combine them together, and it's not that good. And we don't get that much attendance at a lot of the activities on campus. And so to slice them into all these separate pieces is really counterproductive. So I would be a huge supporter of trying to have some kind of, collaboration and, meeting. I mean, it could be that we do work in Columbia and you have a project in Columbia, and we could, there could be cooperation. Or that we decide that we're gonna, in the age of COVID, that we're gonna do a project we have a project on that we're planning for on an indigenous community in Pine Ridge in South Dakota, with a real superhero local leader guy, and there's all sorts of engineering necessities on Pine Ridge, right? So I mean, there's so many ways that we could leverage the groups on campus, but it's a huge challenge because of this tradition of people needing these leadership positions.
Definitely. We'll be sure to keep you in the loop on that to
Yeah.
try to centralize all those resources. I like a lot of what you said, especially we shouldn't just be students experimenting with another community in the world with our engineering knowledge. We need to be focusing on what experts are telling us, and may that change our entire model. That's okay.
And
like I said before.
and particularly local experts.
Yeah. Yes. Definitely. I'll let someone else ask a question now. I think I took up too much time.
No, it was great. Thank you.
So back to so on the topic of sucking up the oxygen, do you think that maybe overall global philanthropy should decrease to kind of just let these communities evolve naturally?
Well, you have this big debate that comes from the group called the post-developmentalists, and there was a guy who gave a speech in Mexico City, Ivan Illich, in 1968, to what essentially was the Peace Corps of American kids who were sacrificing to go help Mexico. And he said, leave us alone, climb our mountains, drink our tequila, have some fun, have encounters, friends, but don't come here to save us. And that led to this whole idea. There was a Colombian sociologist, Arturo Escobar, who was like the head of this post-development camp. So on the one hand, you have the white man's burden camp. On the other hand, you have this other camp of post-development, which is don't let them develop alone. And we think they're both wrong and have this alternative vision that we have developed. I think right now the people of the Global South need more resources and not less. But I think for the most part, these resources should channel through the projects, ideas, innovation, successes that are already existing on the ground.
I have a question about articulating some of this local expertise that you were talking about, because so I'm not an American. I come from India, and perhaps I have less of a burden as a result. I don't know, but I think something that I often run into is that I try to explain to people that like in India, people use, I don't know, thatch for roofs, so it's like leaves. It's not a permanent roof. And I try to explain to people this isn't backward technology. This doesn't mean it's bad. It's actually it's much smarter in those climates to build like that, and build with laterite, build with clay, than to build with cement, which just ends up with more problems, and then you have to deliver electricity to all these places where it's really challenging, and then you end up with environmental problems. And it's just trying to articulate that mode of thinking, and that this kind of it's just another. It's another world and another kind of science in a way. But I think that the kind of scientific language that American engineers speak, or even Indian engineers speak, just doesn't have the words to explain those without making them sound backward and stupid. So I guess I'm not even sure if I'm articulating this question correctly, but how do you even talk about these kind of local experts in a way that is neither demeaning nor, I guess, ignoring their unique knowledge?
Yeah, I think that that's really tricky, because the implicit bias is so powerful in that. I remember when my friend, who the banker also gives money to Georgia Tech, he supports the VIP project that we have, and he pays for my chair. So I have him totally hooked in. And so Georgia Tech, we invited us to the president's box a few years ago for a football game. And we were there, and we could not believe it. It was just what what century are we in? We had like 5 or 6 different people come up to talk to us about what we were doing, and it automatically always swung in to this story about the inventor prize of someone who invented a pay toilet for Kenya. And those damn Kenyans were too backwards to even be hygienic with this pay toilet. And we were like, is this the 1930s or the 1870s or where are we? And who would have thought that, a bunch of some gringos showing up with a pay toilet in Kenya would have a 1 in a bajillion chance of succeeding? So this type of discourse happens all the time, right? We had this in with the play pumps, where the women in these African villages had hand pumps, and they worked perfectly fine. But of course, the play pumps with the kids pushing the merry-go-rounds looked, so much more exciting on the brochures, and no one ever. I mean, this was supported like crazy, and not one person had the idea that after how many hours in the sun pushing a merry-go-round does that turn from fun into child exploitation, right? I mean, if you're doing that 10 hours a day, 365 days a year, I don't think that's a very fun activity. So then the women were all super mad because they end up having to push this stupid merry-go-round because they didn't have their hand pumps anymore, which didn't break down, were far easier to use, super cheap, etc. So this kind of technological disconnect is really difficult to address.
I just had one last question. I don't mean to monopolize all the time, but
That's okay.
one thing obviously people are pretty financially motivated. If there's like a way to make it so that investing in a lot of these underdeveloped nations in a way that's beneficial to them has financial upside, then like a lot of people would do it. So I was wondering, like, with your work with, your banker friend, have you talked about sort of making kind of an avenue so that bigger banks, like Goldman, Morgan, or some of those guys can start investing safely in these underdeveloped nations, expecting, a pretty safe financial return? Because at the end of the day, like a lot of these nations have huge potential, like financial upside without a whole lot lower really to a
Yeah,
goal in a lot of areas.
yeah.
So I was wondering if you guys have worked on something like that.
We have, and in the United States, banks have a responsibility to invest so much public good money in the communities where they take deposits from. And this kind of idea is spreading to banks and businesses in Brazil also. So it would be a big stretch to get banks here to be interested in that. But we're meeting with, in fact, my friend John is golfing with the head of global the global unit of Credit Suisse Bank, which has a huge bank system in Brazil for private banking. So, we're trying to get the banks and businesses in Brazil, which is really difficult because the discrimination and the bias and stereotype of the elite Brazilians towards the people that lives in the favelas is far greater than what we have, right? They have very strong negative views of people in the favelas. So, but I mean, it's a time I think that we have this big opportunity with the kind of global awakening of Black Lives Matter, and especially using the language of implicit bias instead of the language of racism, right? Because no, that turns everyone off, and you have no conversation. But you can encompass all of the same things when you talk about implicit bias, and people are far more readily willing to accept their implicit bias that everyone has than their racism that some white college professor from Atlanta tells them they have, right? So we're doing exactly what you're saying, but with Brazil and through the Brazilian alumni. And we're going to probably do the same in the United States in communities with local banks eventually.
I wanted to ask just one quick thing. I know, as working I'm on the Jamaica team for EWB, and it's been challenging to implement solutions effectively, primarily because there is that cultural difference between, American culture and Jamaican culture. They're more laid back, and some of American culture is pretty fast paced, So I was just wondering if you could comment on your experience with dealing with that cultural difference and how maybe that could also be a factor in, failures of these projects, not understanding completely that cultural difference.
Yeah, so we work in Brazil and now we're working in Colombia, and there's a lot, even though it's quite different between the two countries, there are huge cultural differences than how we would do things. So what we try to do is have as few rules as possible, and we try to adjust our culture to their culture. So we don't try to give any incentives for them to act or talk, or we try to maximize what they're doing well, right? What are they doing well? They are teaching these kids to samba dance and turning them into we have this whole theory from Iceland on youth. We're really trying to change youth, and quickly what it is that Iceland used to have the highest number of percentage of kids in Europe that had alcohol and drug abuse problems. Now they have the lowest. And why? Because they put in this program of switching addictions from negative addictions to positive addictions. So if you so that's something we really support, are these organizations that have high level performance activities that give kids addictions. And we have this whole set of models and things that give these kids addictions. But so we choose on that, and then we find people who are actually doing that. And then we adjust our expectations of schedules and mainly schedules to what their ideas of schedules are. Why? They have a loose schedule for really good reasons. They have rains 3 times a year that completely devastates the community. The drug dealers could be taken over by the militias, and they could have, active gunfire. The police could there's so many things that happen in those communities that trying to have them merge into our culture is not very useful. So we adapt their particular way of doing things, and it's been incredibly satisfying. And sometimes we have to think that everything doesn't have to happen so fast.
Right. Cool. Does anybody else have any questions?
So in terms of finding like people to fund, do you guys, I mean, you mentioned that you had like a one-page application, but I mean, obviously many of the like local leaders are not going to be like, tech savvy, going through Google looking for, financial grants and stuff like that. So what's kind of your long-term strategy for consistently finding local talent?
We were in Colombia for a week and a half, and I think we had over 150 organizations that fit our criteria in no time. So I think that's one of the biggest shocks that we had to our system, was how ubiquitous these types of we would think they're unicorns, but they're really ubiquitous. People who, for example, There's a guy we met in Colombia on the Pacific coast who started to teach kids to surf on doors. And over time they got surfboards and now they're surfing all over the world. They're like superstar surfers. And it's been going on for like 10 years, and he keeps these kids motivated and with all of these goals and addicted to a better activity than hanging out on the streets and selling drugs, which is what their contemporaries are doing in that community. So the number of these organizations, the problem isn't finding the organizations. The problem is selecting the organizations, because we had to say no to so many worthy causes. We just don't have enough money and time. So hopefully our book will inspire other people to do it, right? That's what we hope.
Cool. So I don't want to take anybody else's time. Dr. Bowman, thank you so much
Thank you.
for taking some time to talk to us. Very interesting. For everybody else, found it really interesting too. So hope to stay in contact. And yeah.
Great. All right. I hope to hear from some of you. Have a good evening.
For sure, you too.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.